Thank you all for coming. I guess most of you know Kate, but we're very pleased to have her talk to us about her new book and her writing and researching process. And sounds very fascinating, so take it away, Kate.
Thank you. Thank you for coming, everybody, and everybody at home watching. I'm going to talk today about my new book. Just came out through a bakery window. It takes place in 1899, so I had to do a lot of research for this one. And before I do some readings from it, I'm going to talk about that process of researching. It's very interesting to me. So, well, the first thing I want to say, I have notes here, just so I don't forget anything, that I am a writer who does not set things up ahead of time. I'm a by the seat of the pants writer. This one a little bit less because the story was there. It's loosely based on a story that happened in a small town in New England outside of Worcester in 1899. So there are already some events, and actually, there's been some other things written about it. There are things, you know, in the Spencer Library about what happened. There was like a crime thing. In the 30s, something was written up in one of those crime magazines that was called Sinister Halo. And it said, a timeless classic that seems to get revisited about every 20 years or so. And he wrote, this is the story of what is probably the most amazing mystery in New England. So this was very, you know, I think he put in a lot more crimes than actually happened. And, but anyways, that was the first time that it was brought to the attention of the reading public. And in the 90s, when just after I'd started looking into working on this, some people wrote about it. They lived in maybe one of the houses where one of the crimes had been committed or suicides or whatever they were. And they wrote more about the crimes themselves and about what happened afterwards. And actually, it was written up a few years ago, just a couple of pages, in a book called Murder and Mayhem in Worcester County. And that was just like about 2 or 3 pages. She was like talking about a lot of things. So there's a history to this story. And I did not focus on the crime part of it. Mine is more, basically what there was going on was there was a romance going on between 2 of the really richest families in town. The woman and the man, the young woman and the man, their parents owned the 2 big mill businesses in town, and they started dating. And their families, especially her mother and his father, were not happy about that. So that's basically the story. My story starts, the incidents happened in January of 1899. My story starts in like April of 1898. And they are just starting to date at that time. So mine's more of a story of romance. And another thing I loved about writing it, now I'm getting to the whole research aspect of it, is I had to do a lot of research on Worcester and what was going on. And it was a very interesting and exciting place at the time. Just to give you an idea, though, about doing research, is that when you're writing a novel and doing research, you can either get lost in a black hole, or you can wander happily lost in a forest, a magical forest of some kind. And both has happened to me. So the first thing I might do is give you one of my favorite quotes I've heard lately. And this just gives you an example of what happens when you go on the net now and try to find something. I heard a quote by Ray Bradbury, which is about writing, and it is, let's say, to write a novel is to jump off a cliff and build your wings on the way down. And I really like that. So, but I wanted to make sure I got it right when I was going to do this. So I went on the net to make sure that I had the right quote. And where do I get? I get something that says quote, it's a quote checker. And so I find out all this other stuff. Like, two other people were supposed to have said that, like Annie Dillard's supposed to have said it and Kurt Vonnegut. So this quote checker in place said, no, it actually was Ray Bradbury. And they thanked Annie Dillard for letting them know that she never said that. And Ray Bradbury said it in several different instances, not just about writing. He said it about fear of the future, because he was kind of a futuristic writer and science fiction writer. So it was indeed Ray Bradbury, but I found out a bunch of other things, but I tried to make sure of that. So anyways, and I also have been reading Stephen King's book on writing, and he says that when you write your first draft, you write it for yourself, and subsequent drafts, you start writing it for people. And I know what he means because it's this jumping off a cliff thing again. And I went way back in research. Just after I left this project in the early 90s, I was working on a novel that took place in 9th century Ireland, because I was totally, you know, enmeshed in that, in my imagination, in my mind. So I remember, like, when you're working on something as long as a novel, you want to stop at a place where you give yourself room to start again. And I kind of remember one scene where it was in Dublin, and my character was about to open a curtain of some kind that was in a house, and I didn't know what was going to be there. And as much as I wanted to keep sitting and find out what was going to be there, I just saved that for the next day, so my imagination would be at play, even while I wasn't sitting at my desk. So that's one of the cool things that happens when you're writing the first draft. But it's not usually very good writing. So then you have to go back and you have to, you know, like look at the words and take up the stuff that the reader doesn't really need to know, but you needed to write it to understand the character. So anyways, a few other things about doing research. There's a few different ways to do research, and it certainly has changed since I started this novel in 1983. And when I started working on it again in 2018. Let's see. Back then, the kind of research I did both on the 9th century novel and on this novel came through snail mail. Like, I sent away for this book on cars and caravans. I have an 1890s album, which has things that like water closets and buildings, airplanes. And I also, because I was kind of writing out people who had some money, I got these cool kind of cards with outfits on them from that time period. And on the back, it tells you all about the different outfits. So, and the 9th century Ireland was really, that was rough. It was wonderful because I spent hours doing research that I did not, that was not a bad thing at all for me. And I also used it as an excuse to go back to Ireland. I lived there in the 70s for a year, but I used it as an excuse to go back to Ireland in 1992 and to a program called Monastic Odyssey. And we spent like a week at Trinity learning about the archaeology and the monastic studies. And then we went and drove a bus around to the different monastic sites and monasteries and stayed different places. So that was great. But I never finished that project for a few different reasons. But anyway, yeah, it is really hard to figure out 9th century. I did actually have a few people look at that novel. Robert Cormier, who lived in Leominster, of course. I worked at the Leominster Library for about a year, and he would come in. This is another whole thing about how you can do research too. Children's libraries are really good for research, because say like you're looking for something about Ferris wheels, they will give you really straightforward, simple information. And if an adult is writing a big book about it, they're gonna focus on one thing. You have to read this until you get your information. You're gonna have to read the whole thing. And I remember one time he came to the desk to take out, I think it was books about billiards from the children's libraries. I have characters into billiards and I know nothing about them. So he gave me that idea, and actually very nicely, he did give, I told him I was writing a novel, and he gave me the name of the literary agent. So I knew I'd at least get it looked at because the agent told me that my research was showing too much. So that can really happen. Like I said, it can become a black hole. It can keep you from doing the project. And in this case, you know, I was knowing too much for that character in the 9th century. But some other things I was doing was getting the archaeology magazines in the mail, Ireland's Archaeology History Ireland. So I learned a lot and I really liked it. But also the other thing about doing something that far back, where archaeology has some of the information, is history changes. So I must have read like 30 books. Johanna at Mount Wachusett was doing interlibrary loan there, and I was getting articles from like all over the world about the Vikings, because that was a period I was in, and I loved the illuminated manuscript stuff. And it was just bringing all this information together. And then the archaeologists would discover something else, and no, we were wrong. That wasn't the reason they built the towers there. It was something else. So it was like, okay, now I have to do all this research. But now I feel like, you know, it's your imagination, so you really don't have to be completely accurate. It could have, and they really don't know. I mean, they think that it was used for one thing, but again, you see history changing. So 9th century is a hard one. I may go back to it sometime again, but that is kind of a hard one to go back to. So anyways, I wanted to talk a little about research on this novel that, like I said, changed a lot. You know, this was the kind of research I was doing in 1983. And I'll just remake it. I was going on microfilm and getting things from the Worcester Telegram, because this was kind of a big deal. It was covered in the Worcester Telegram. But this is not so much, some of what I was doing was getting just, I wanted to see what was in the newspaper at the time. And let's see, here's something that says, beautiful old heirlooms found in Worcester. Leicester lad pawns them for cash and a shotgun. So that's the kind of things that were going on in Worcester. And I can find it. Something about electricity here. Now here it is. Spencer Gas Company contracts for new dynamo lights, engine, and boiler. The reorganized Spencer Gas Company has made contracts for the augmentation and betterment of street lighting service. And Wednesday, Treasurer blah, 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 was able to announce the most important of the changes The present dynamo will be supported by one large brush dynamo from the General Electric Company's latest design with a capacity of 10 arc lights at 1,200 candle power each. So they were comparing the light to candlelight, of course. So before I do the reading, I just have a little bit more to talk about because 2018, okay, I had kind of forgotten about this whole thing. And I was cleaning my house out crazy in 2017. It was like throwing things. We actually rented one of those, bins to throw things in. And I found about 90 pages of the original document that I typed up. And I put it in, for a while, I put it in a one of those postal boxes. So it was all like crunched up. And so it went from this to this. So I didn't know, I just got the other one published, so I knew I probably had to publish it for it. So I said, I'll see if I still have the energy and the, the enthusiasm to try to make a story out of it. So I took these crumpled pages that were kind of annoying because I couldn't make them go straight, and I did get the story out of it. And there was a much easier way to do research now. I have things about spiritualism in it. And you really, it was interesting to do research on Worcester. It was a very up and coming place. And I was really trying not to make my characters be overwhelmed by the research I did. It has to be part of the character's personality. So for instance, there were a lot of buildings going up in Worcester at the time. The Worcester Art Museum, 1897. They were building new City Hall. Clark University was built in the late 1890s. The first skyscraper, which was the State Mutual Assurance building, came up, and they were kind of like trying to outdo Boston. It had a skyscraper, and they kind of did because the one in Worcester had the first steel beams in it, instead of just like the other construction. And that was the State Mutual building built in about 1897. So one of the two young people, Michael, who's 22 and just graduated from college, he wants to be an architect. His father thinks, of course, that he's going to take over with the in the mill, and secretly he's studying to be an architect. So then I can throw that in there, when he's talking with Lily, who is the 18-year-old who just graduated from high school. She's the young woman in the story. And a couple of other really interesting things that I found out that I was able to use a little bit was, so Michael would have gone to maybe WPI, that was there, because he went to a business school, but his father also sent him, there was a lot of things in Worcester at the time that had to do with labor unrest and the unions, and also women's suffrage. And his father had sent him into the mills to work the overnight shift to see what it was like. So that's when I was doing research and found out that there were these carts that went around to feed people, to sell food to the people doing the third shift, which probably became the all-night diners later in the cities. So they were called the night wagons, and they had food. They provided food for the people who were working the third shift. So, so a lot of interesting research is found, and I tried to use what I could and not use too much. But anyways, I guess that's my whole thing about the research, and I will now read a couple of passages from the book called Through a Bakery Window. The first passage is kind of like Lily and Michael's first date. Again, he's 22, she's 18. They've known each other because they live in a small town, but they're just starting to be romantically involved with each other. Lily was nervous as Michael led her into the parlor. The dour aspect of his house made her uncomfortable, and though Michael had said it would be fine, she'd expected his mother to be with them in the parlor as a chaperone. She giggled and put her hand over her mouth, which only made it worse. She laughed out loud, then snorted. Shh. Michael looked at Lily and then up to the ceiling. My mother's not feeling well. She's resting upstairs. Lily flushed and turned toward the window to hide her face. Had her high spirits caused a breach in formality, or were they actually sneaking around? Don't be shushing her. Olive, the kitchen maid, had come in unnoticed with a tray of muffins and tea. It's good to hear a cheerful laugh. Lord knows it can be like living in a coffin around here. She thinks I'm about 6 years old, Michael whispered to Lily. She'd tie my shoes if I let her. If you were 6 years old, I wouldn't be serving you in the parlor with a pretty young mess. You're hardly older than I am, Michael said, and don't think you'll always get the last word. I have 15 years or more on you, young man. There, now I've got the last word, so I'll leave you two alone. I guess that's how they do things nowadays. Call if you need anything more. Olive left with her hands in her apron pockets and walked through the hall pantry to the kitchen. I really like her, Lily said, smoothing her skirts as she sat on the couch. I used to think she was formal and stuffy when I came here as a girl. One of the braids around her head was coming loose, and she tried to tuck the stray pieces back as she sat. Do you think she approves of us being here alone together? Michael sat down next to her. With my father, she is formal. He insists on it. When my father wasn't around, even my mother was familiar with her. Treats her like one of the family. Maybe the daughter she never had. I'm sure she doesn't mind you being here. She's very discreet. More than can be said about the new maid. Michael brushed a curl from Lily's cheek and put his arm around her. She rested her head against his shoulder. I'm afraid your father doesn't care for me. Don't worry about him. It's just his way. Please don't take offense. Anyway, he stays late at the mill on Saturday, off until after sundown. We should have a piece here for at least, he took out his pocket watch and looked at it, an hour, maybe two, before he barges in. A few minutes of silence passed between them. He looked at her, kissed her on the forehead, then rested his head on hers. Lily looked in the corner away from Michael. She was not comfortable here, though she wanted so much to be with him. What is it? Michael said. My feet are just really pitched in these narrow walking boots. I wish women were allowed to wear comfortable shoes. Are you for women's rights then? We should have rights, at least to dress as comfortably as men. She sat forward, pouted, crossed her arms, and looked at him with narrowed eyes. Are we bickering, Michael asked? Just our first mother's quarrel, she said. He lifted her chin and looked into her face. It's not a quarrel if I agree with you. Women and workers should have rights. She pushed away, leaned down, and unlaced her shoes. Better not let your father hear you say that. My father and I don't see eye to eye on several things. He doesn't want anything to change. He's afraid of it. Afraid of what? Afraid of everything. Change. How do you mean? Your father seems to have no fear. Everyone is afraid of him. Well, he doesn't approve of the trolleys coming through town. He still thinks a covered carriage is the only proper conveyance for people. And even for goods, business is going to suffer if he doesn't keep up with the times. The other day, Mother wanted to take the trolley into Worcester with her sister just as an adventure, and he wouldn't hear of it. Probably afraid she'd go to a women's meeting behind his back. He won't even let her go to the women's club that helps the needy. Afraid he'd lose workers, I suppose, if the masses become too educated. A few years ago, there was a display of electricity at Mechanics Hall, and he wouldn't take me. I had to go with a friend's family. My mother wants me to go to those meetings, Lily said. She says women need more power, need to be educated about finance and politics. But I don't know. Really, Lily, we should. There's so many interesting things to do in the city. She smiled. Maybe we can take a trolley ride together. Okay, I'm going to flip forward a little bit.
Can we clap? That
Yes.
was- May I just say that the research did not overwhelm the
Okay.
writing. The
Thank you.
writing came out of it very natural. And you worked a lot of stuff in there, but it made sense.
Okay,
It was very
great, yeah.
natural, so you did a good job.
It worked.
You've come a long way with it.
Thanks. In this scene, there is Suzanne, who is a maid for Lily's family, the Chapmans, and Daisy, who is a maid for the Sawyer family, Michael's family. A new woman in town named Kathleen. She is a domestic at the hotel in town. She's new in town. And they're in Worcester at a seance that Kathleen has taken them to. Their hosts are Rosanna and Sam. And Mrs. Kaminsky is the medium. We welcome you all here to our session tonight, and we're grateful to have Mrs. Kaminsky here to uncover the knowledge of the spirit world. We sit at the spirit table as Elizabeth Cody Stanton sat in Seneca so many years ago, when with the help and faith of our sisters, she penned the Declaration of Sentiments, bringing organization to the great suffrage movement. And that spirit, knowing the guidance we receive from the spirits, will free us and all those who later in are oppressed and wronged. We will now be silent, and Madame Kaminsky will try to intervene on our behalf. Suzanne looked over at Daisy, who unbelievably seemed to be trying to stifle a giggle. Then she glanced over at Kathleen, who looked serious, almost trance-like. Suzanne, who had been wondering why a few teacups had been set on the table, lurched forward as one near her shook. She turned her head and looked toward the door. Madame Kaminsky made some moaning noises very softly. Then in a stuttering voice, she called out her name. Mary, Mary, my baby, Mary, my baby's baby. I feel you near, feel your breath in this room, a hand that has touched yours, touched by a presence in this room. The teacups clattered. Rosanna looked around the table. Does anyone have a question to ask of the spirit Mary? They all looked around at each other. Suzanne wanted to leave, but she knew she couldn't. Kathleen looked down at the table, trembling. The medium moaned and whispered, Mary would like you to know that she is all right. She suffered much when she was on this earth, but that has now passed. She looks down on all the workers and women and all those who are oppressed and hopes that her death was not in vain. Then Madame Kaminsky collapsed on the table. Suzanne looked at Rosanna alarmed. She'll be fine, don't worry, dear. It takes a lot of energy to transmit messages from the spirits. She needs a deep rest for a few minutes. After a few minutes, Madame Kaminsky raised her head and took a deep breath. Should we go on, Rosanna asked her. Would you like to try again? Madame Kaminsky shook her head, and Sam, who sat next to her, took her hand. Sam said, I think maybe that was quite enough. It was a quick burst, but quite powerful. Madame Kaminsky nodded, and Sam got up and put on the gas lamps over the fireplace. They had no electric lighting in this room. It was considered bad for seances and interference to the spirits. The chairs were brought away, and the table was moved to the middle of the room as guests scattered around to more comfortable chairs. Cups filled with actual tea were brought in along with a fresh apple tart. Suzanne and Daisy sat together in a love seat. Sam stood by the fireplace talking with Madame Kaminsky, and Kathleen sat in a chair next to the girls. Rosanna came over and brought them tea and apple tart. Are you treated well by your families? Rosanna asked, looking from one to the other. We've got no complaints, Daisy said, looking at Suzanne. Not at all, Suzanne said. We're very lucky, really. I've been with the same family for several years now. You're very young, though, Rosanna said. What age were you when they took you out of school to work in service? Oh, we were both able to finish our schooling, Suzanne said, feeling a little uneasy. Well, I'm very glad you came, and I hope you come to the next women's meeting. Sam and I are the ones who have arranged rides for the domestic help to be able to attend. You'll find kindred voices there. I'm glad you're settled with good families. Some of the things we hear from these girls are just terrible. We fight for justice for all our sisters. Susanna nodded. Kathleen, who had been listening, stood and paced the room. Suzanne watched her agitated pacing while Daisy talked with their hostess. Then Kathleen moved to a chair across the room and looked up at the ceiling, lost in thought. It seemed there was more to this evening than a bit of fun for her. Maybe she fancied herself a medium too. Suzanne stood and went over to her, bringing her a cup of tea. She touched her on the shoulder. Kathleen didn't respond at first. She was looking down at the floor, then up at the ceiling. Suzanne thought this had all been too much for the poor woman and worried that they might have to find their own way home after all. Kathleen, Kathleen, she called out a few times. And finally Kathleen looked toward her, but she stared absently as if she was looking right through her. Suzanne held out the cup again. Some tea? You look very tired. We should be getting home soon. Kathleen looked up. Yes, of course. I'm sure you need to get up early. She took a sip of the tea. I'll have Sam get the coach. I feel ready to retire myself. Kathleen put her tea down and went over and spoke to Sam at the fireplace, and a carriage was brought round to the front. Thank you for coming, they shouted and waved. I do hope you make it to the next women's meeting. Daisy and Suzanne waved back, then stepped up into the carriage. Daisy was still waving out the window as the horses began to move. That was so much fun, Daisy said. I'm so glad we came. It was interesting. Could you even believe that she started moaning and whispering a name? I almost fell over in my chair, but then they would have just thought I was channeling the spirit. Suzanne poked Daisy and nodded toward Kathleen, who rested her head against the side of the coach. Daisy, clueless, went on. And she chose the name Mary to be spirit. I think it's safe to say there's always at least one person in the world that has a deceased relative named Mary. Suzanne sighed and gave up trying to get Daisy not to offend their friend. It seemed that Kathleen had fallen asleep anyway. Do you want one more short piece? And this is later in the book. It's Thanksgiving evening, and Lily likes to help the evening before, likes to help Suzanne get everything ready, the baking pies and everything. She used to do it with her Nana when she's growing up, her and her sister Abby, so she likes to still help out. So this is the scene here. Lily walked into the entry and the wonderful smells of the baking pies. She hurried downstairs, hoping that she was not too late to help. She loved to help Suzanne with the baking on Thanksgiving Eve. Am I late? Have I missed all the fun? The mince is done. Suzanne wiped her hands on a sticky, spotted apron. You can help with the apple. What do you need me to do? First, go put on an apron, then you can cut up these apples. I was just mixing the spices together. I don't like to cut them up beforehand because the edges might brown. Lily hurried to the cupboard and put on an apron, then started peeling apples. Leave some for the stuffing, Suzanne reminded her. Put a few aside by the bowl over there with nuts and cranberries. Yes, ma'am. Lily put aside a few apples and cut the others in quarters and eighths. Suzanne, busy with crushing spices and pesto, turned around suddenly, covered her face and sneezed. She rushed to the sink and washed her hands. Did you have a nice outing with Michael today? She asked. We didn't go far, but we had a good evening. We walked out by the hill even though it was starting to snow. There were several bowls set out with spices that Suzanne was labeling. Some were for the turkey and vegetables. You'll have a big job tomorrow getting the turkey in, Lily said. I figure it's just as well. I'll be up very early to put the turkey in, so I'd rather have everything cut and crushed and ready. Stuff the apples, Lily teased, so I didn't go brown. Suzanne looked at her sideways. That's right. Now bring those slices over here so I can mix them in with spices. Lily cut the apples in her apron and brought them down the long wooden table to Suzanne. The dough was already laid out. She had missed that part, the kneading, when you get covered with flour. It had been her favorite part when she was a child. She was sure she had rather hamper it than help at the time. Back then, she would have been helping Nana Parker. "How's Nana?" Lily asked. Susan swished each piece around in a bowl of spices before putting it into the crust. When it was piled high, she added a top layer of dough. Then she trimmed some of the crust along the top and finally crisscrossed a few pieces over it. "About the same," she said. "Rebecca's looking after her. Makes it hard for you with all the holiday baking. I'll manage." She patted some extra butter on the top and sprinkled sugar over it. "There," she said, "that should brown up nicely." Lily rushed to the oven and opened it for her. The pie's baking, Suzanne sat down and put her hand on the table. Her hair was falling out of the kerchief and her apron was stickier and was stained. She filled her cheeks with air and let out a breath. "At least that's done. I'm sorry you're getting so late. I should have been here earlier for you." "No, I know this is my job, not yours. It's better for you to spend time with your fiancé." "You're so good to me, Suzanne, so good to all of us. I feel bad that we won't have more help. But will you manage with the turkey tomorrow? Abby and I could get up early just to get in and then go back to rest again." "Don't you worry about that. Josephine will be here early tomorrow to help for the day. She'll be quite happy for the wages." "Is that your little sister?" "Not so little anymore. She'll be finishing school next year and looking for a place for herself." Thank you. Does anybody have any questions? The title has to do, my first title way back here was "Leave Me Not in Darkness," very gothic. This one I came up with because at the beginning of each chapter, there's two women who are shopkeepers in town. One has a dress shop and one has a bakery that everybody comes into, and she hears all the gossip that's going on from the babes that are coming from the houses. So one of the women, the woman who owns the dress shop, comes in early before the bakery opens anyone, and they sit and they gossip about what's going on at the big houses and have their coffee. So that's where through a bakery window came in.
I have a question. Where did you do your research on the seances, Kate?
On the seances,
And spiritualism?
I got a lot of it from the net, actually. From the what? From the internet.
Oh, yeah.
I read a couple of books. I read one by, oh God, what's her name? The very famous history writer, the most famous one in the world.
Agatha Christie?
She has one book with the seance.
Okay.
So of course I had to read that, and a couple of other books I might have seen.
Yeah.
And I actually get into a little more, because in one part of the book,
Yeah.
they are in Europe and they're in England, and like Yates was really big on spiritualism, and I've read about that. So I kind of revisited that with the Yates interest in that.
Because you, like, I'm interested in that because I'm Victorianist. So,
Yeah.
And you know, I kind of like things connected to the supernatural, but especially historically in literature. And, you know, spiritualism in this country actually was was kind of a religion. In fact, it had more adherents than most of the traditional religions.
Oh, yeah?
And there's a really good special, we just watched it, it's an older one, PBS, called Telegrams from the Dead.
Ooh, never heard of it.
It's really, you should see if you can get a hold of it. It's, no, it's really good because it much what I'm saying to you has that information. And, you know, I've just read some other things.
Okay, yeah.
Yeah, but
Nice.
you kind of had down what people were doing and,
Yeah.
you know, and the little meal.
But I did kind of have a hard time because, you know, you don't know
Yeah.
what information to trust so much. But again, it's your imagination, so
Yeah.
you throw that in there.
Yeah.
But that's good to know. The book I'm working on now, I've watched a lot of PBS specials on different topics. They're great for information and they're interesting.
This is the one that's set in 1935?
Yeah, 1938.
38, I'm sorry, okay.
Oh, 39.
Yeah.
I think it's 39, because I didn't want the hurricane of 38 to, I
Yeah,
wanted
yeah.
that to have already happened.
Yes, right.
The traveling down the New England coast in 39.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's good.
Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for all your attention and interest.
Well, I'm looking forward to reading it. I
Oh,
mean,
good.
it sounds
Thank
really,
you.
it sounds very nice.
Yeah, thank you. Let me know how it is. I have books for sale. They can be bought through Amazon, but I have actual books here that I can sign. I have some of my other novel too. This is also a mystery, a little bit darker than the other one in terms of there's like a tragedy in it. And these are 17, and these are on sale for $10, kind of by the box.
Kate, can I ask another question?
Sure.
You know, it's really interesting when you have to write about people who really lived.
Yeah,
And
and that's really,
I was wondering how much of their personalities is you
yeah.
just, you know, making it work for your story? How much did you
Yeah, that's
pull out?
Yeah, there's, I mean, the stories there, like
Yeah.
what happened is there, but not really the personalities of the people.
Right.
So I really, like I said, mine, I pulled out like the idea of the romance.
Yeah.
And the idea of bringing in like things that were going on socially.
Yes,
Like
yeah.
what was permitted and what wasn't.
Yeah.
The unrest with the unions, the women's suffrage,
Yeah.
the starting to look at like domestic violence and domestics in general in a
Yes.
different way. So yeah, that's mostly what I brought in. It's really loosely based and
Right.
they hopefully honored it rather than taking advantage of it, like sinister halo.
Yeah. You didn't make it as exploitation.
Exploitation, and it really is, it's a story, and it's been kicking around for over 100 years.
Yeah.
You know, people still talk about it, and that kind of, I love stories, so that kind of amazes me. This is my dedication in the front,
Yeah.
because I was thinking of that, and it's been kicking around for over 100 years, and it's not going away. Loosely based on a true story that occurred in a small town outside of Worcester, Massachusetts. I would like to dedicate the novel to the historians, reporters, storytellers, families, and possibly ghosts that have kept this story alive in one form or another for over 100 years.
Okay. That's nice.
Because some people
Yeah.
do think some of the homes are haunted, you know,
Yeah.
that they live in or whatever, but or did
Yeah.
at one time. Yeah. That sounds
Are
great.
the homes still there?
Yes, the old Victorian homes.
So did you have access to them?
I just usually, I drove by them. When I first found out about the story, I was working with somebody who had bought an old Victorian house in Spencer. And I don't think that ended up being one of the houses that I happened to, but I did go to the house and, you know, talked about it. The project was, he was gonna do research and I was gonna write it, but it kind of fell apart somewhat. So, so I did go into an old Victorian house in Spencer, and, yeah, the house is still there, and, you know, people live in them and stuff.
Now, in your book, you mentioned addresses, so we can drive by.
Yeah, so I don't even remember the address, honest to goodness truth. People in Spencer probably do, I mean, it's, the whole incidents are in the histories of Spencer and stuff, so.
You'll have to let us know if you get some responses from people from Spencer.
Yeah, I am going to the Spencer Senior Center.
Oh,
actually.
yeah.
Yeah,
You may get.
just before I go to the, you know, that Monday, and then on that, the next Saturday, I'm going to the Leicester. Yeah, so there might be some people around there. Yeah, and the funny thing is too, in this whole, when I found this, and I was thinking, what am I gonna do for another project? Another thing that happened was, somebody who had made, either me or he had asked to be friends on Facebook,
Yeah.
was somebody who had known from Spencer a little bit way back then.
Yeah.
And I go into my things in my and he knew that I had been working on this book a long time ago, and I go into he tagged me in this.
Oh.
Put it on the Facebook, I'm like, oh my God, that's still kicking around.
Yeah.
And, at the same time, I just found this, so
Yeah.
those two things, and so I'm sending him a copy, so,
Oh,
yeah,
yeah, serendipity.
yeah. Those two things happened at the same time.
Yeah, that's great.
Yeah. Thank you, everybody, so much for coming and listening.
Thank you.
Yeah,
It really, I know I have 2 copies at home. Those are going to be Christmas presents. I'm going to buy